Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's edition of Smithsonian Social Studies Online. We are so excited to have you join us today. Today, we're going to be talking about the question, what happens when cultures collide? Now, before I hand this over to my colleagues to start this conversation, just a couple of ground rules. We ask that you join us in conversation. Please use the text box, the chat box that you see on your screen to ask questions of Beth and Orlando. But when you do answer things or ask questions, we ask that you keep all personal information confidential. We don't want that. And also, please, if you're a teacher or a parent watching with your student, we encourage you to actively participate with them. So with that, we're looking forward to a great conversation, and I'll hand it over to you, Orlando.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Abby, for that introduction. Folks who are joining us live, thank you for being with us the day before this really sort of different Memorial Day weekend. We hope that you'll be able to get some time with family that, is a little bit less stressful than it has been recently. We were talking about puzzles before we met. Maybe you get to do a puzzle, play a board game. I don't know, but thank you for being with us today. And joining us, we have Beth Evans, who works at the National Portrait Gallery. My name is Orlando Serrano. I'm the manager for youth and teacher programs at the National Museum of American History. Before we jump in and we get started and we get to talk about these cultural resources that Beth has brought with her today, Beth, can you introduce yourself a little bit to us? What is the National Portrait Gallery? How is it different than Smithsonian American Art and the National Gallery of Art? Because quite frankly, I often get those mixed up. So can you tell us, what the difference is, where your institution sits within those three?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Abby and Orlando, for having me. I'm Beth Evans. I work at the National Portrait Gallery. The National Portrait Gallery is part of the Smithsonian. We share a building with the Smithsonian American Art Museum. We are another fine art museum in Washington, D.C., but we also consider ourselves a history museum. We look at U.S. art and history and biography and culture all through the lens of portraiture, visual representations of people, and we talk about their stories. We collect and share stories of people who have shaped U.S. history, and we believe that every portrait tells a story, and my job within the education department at the Portrait Gallery is to help people make connections with the art that's on display. We help them understand why we should care about history and why we should care about art.
Wonderful. And, what is your title, Beth, at the Portrait Gallery? And what is your job like on a day-to-day basis? How is it that you go about helping folks make connections to the works of art in the galleries?
Yeah, I am the Youth and Family Programs Manager. So I help plan and facilitate programs for intergenerational audiences, meaning everyone from babies to grandparents and everyone in between. And these programs, some of them are ongoing weekly programs, some of them are large-scale festivals. And I also work a lot with our Latinx audiences in trying to identify programs that would appeal to Spanish-speaking families, Spanish-speaking visitors. And right now, some of our programs are now offered virtually on Facebook and on Instagram. And I also help facilitate a program called the Conversation Circles, which is an English language program for people from all over the world who want to learn about U.S. history and art and culture through portraiture. So each week, we now on Zoom takes a chronological walk through U.S. history with portraits.
That's wonderful, and learning English through art and portraiture definitely beats the way that my Bobby learned English, which was by watching Heart to Heart, a 1980s soap opera. So
Classic.
I really wish that this was available to him. Our conversations would have been very different at the dinner, but let's just put it that way. All right. Now, before we start looking at the collection that you brought with you today, the small area of focus that we're going to get through, can you please tell us a little bit about your thinking, as you went through all the portraits that are available to you in your collection? What is the the sort of circle that you drew around these particular cultural resources, how do you think they all work together to get at our question about how cultures collide?
Yeah, I love this prompt because it helps us avoid the pitfall of discussing US history in terms of there being one monolithic US culture. Oftentimes, students of US history are taught the history of the Northern European colonizers. But the US history is not the history of whiteness. There have been cultures here for centuries and millennia. And as various cultures have sprung up in these lands and have collided, these collisions, these interactions have at times been violent, but they've also been very, very productive and help shaping how our culture evolves over time. I think it's interesting to talk about U.S. culture in terms of these collisions. This has been really interesting for me.
All right. All right. Well, as Abby reminded everybody before we get started, if you do have any questions, please go ahead and drop them in the chat box. We will get to them. Doesn't matter if we're in the middle of talking about one of our cultural resources, we'll pause, address it, and then we'll get back to our conversation. So please do not hesitate to ask us what you're thinking about. Let us know what's on your mind. All right, Beth, our first resource for today. This is quite, we've been, you asked earlier, how long have we been doing these social studies online? We've been doing them for about 2 months, and this is our third encounter with Harriet Tubman, and each one has been different. We've had different versions of her, and last week we actually talked about Harriet Tubman on a stamp with Jesse Aucoin from the National Postal Museum. So can you please tell us, a little bit about Harriet's story and why we are starting here?
Yeah. First of all, I'm not surprised that Harriet Tubman has featured so prominently. She is, I think, U.S. history and culture can be really messy and hard, and she is sort of this inspirational figure that we aspire to be, that greatness can come from anyone and anywhere. This image itself, I think, is so interesting because let's talk about what we're seeing here. We're seeing a print of Harriet Tubman in a Union soldier's uniform. We oftentimes think of Harriet Tubman through her work with the Underground Railroad, bringing enslaved people to freedom. But her story is so much more than that. Her story, really, in thinking about today's topic, is a microcosm for all of these clashes that brought about the Civil War. South versus North, enslaved versus free, slave owners versus abolitionists, the agrarian economy that relied upon the forced labor of enslaved people versus this increasingly industrialized economy in the North. And then, of course, Black versus white. And her main goal through all of these clashes was to end slavery. And so she fought fearlessly against the Confederacy. She was a nurse, she was a spy, she was a scout, and she even helped lead a raid that ultimately freed about 700 enslaved people in one of the Carolinas. I can't remember which one, but seeing her in this Union soldier's uniform, it shifts our idea, and I think it expands our idea of just how much she accomplished in her lifetime.
Yeah, I really appreciate the idea of thinking about Harriet Tubman and this particular rendering of her as embodying all these different collisions coming together at the same time. Thank you for laying out the North versus South. We've got the, she's in the Union uniform, and the agrarian versus industrializing economy, Black versus white. That's all really, really interesting. And as I zoomed in to get look a little bit more at the details, and as we open up our information here, we can see that this is a woodcut. Can you let us know a little bit about what is distinct about a woodcut? What is the process? How does one make this? And for folks looking along at home, you can see all these little lines throughout the piece. So can you tell us more about this particular form?
Sure. Well, this image was created to be an illustration for a book written a few years after the Civil War called Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman by Sarah H. Bradford. And Harriet Tubman was a celebrity in her time, even. A woodcut is a type of relief print, meaning that the negative image is cut into the material. Think about like your standard rubber stamp, but instead of rubber, it's a piece of wood. And so a sharp, like metal object is used to carve the image, and then ink is applied, and then that is pressed onto the paper. So that's why we can see so many lines. The shading is used or is created through the lines, the thickness and the repetition of the lines. This is a technique that's been used for centuries all over the world.
That's wonderful. It's really pretty. Yeah, it's one of my favorites, and we'll get to that later on. I've tried my hand at wood cutting, folks. If you want to, or at screen printing, it's difficult and it takes a lot of patience, which apparently I don't have. That's what I've learned about myself. But thank you for this image and for starting us off here with this great conversation. Let's move on to our second cultural resource. This is a beautiful image. I know that we had originally started off talking about a different portrait, and we shifted yesterday to talk about Chief Joseph, and I do know a little bit more about him, but can you tell us about why you selected him and how this image in which he's looking away from the artist embodies cultures colliding?
Yeah, Chief Joseph, as a leader of the Nez Perce Nation, was he himself, as an indigenous person, his story reminds us that indigenous traditions and cultures have existed in these lands for centuries before white colonizers arrived. But this image itself, this is a photograph that was taken by a photographer named Edward Sheriff Curtis. And it reminds us how representation and portraiture are acts of power. Colonizers don't just write the dominant narrative of history, they also dictate the visual representation of history, which affects everything from our textbooks to what we see in museums. And in this case, Curtis, the photographer, he was very sympathetic to the plight of Native Americans and the mistreatment and the forced relocation. At the same time, though, he was a white man entering these Native American spaces and dictating how these people were going to be represented. And so at times he shifted the reality of Native Americans. He at times would photograph Native Americans in dress that their people had not worn for decades. When they were wearing denim, he still wanted to photograph them wearing their traditional attire because that was the more romanticized version. So here we have this image of Chief Joseph. This was taken on the reservation where he and his people were forced to live through the remainder of his life after they were captured by U.S. soldiers. And I think it's a really interesting idea. We talk about portraiture in terms of a three-way sort of relationship between the artist, the sitter, and then the viewer. And I wonder, when I look at photographs of Native Americans, how much autonomy the sitter, meaning the person in the portrait, actually had and how they were represented. I don't know if he chose to wear this clothing. I don't know if he even wanted to have his photograph taken. But there is still this sort of strength and resilience that I see in him. But then I wonder how much of that is what the photographer, how he framed the portrait. I don't know. It's an interesting question.
Yeah, well, and Beth, thank you for all that context, and for folks joining us. I really enjoy getting to talk with all of our guests, but one of the highlights of talking with folks and conversing with folks from the art museums is helping us understand how to break down images and art and how to conduct visual analysis. And so when thinking about portraiture here, Beth, I appreciate you pointing out that we should think about the relationship between the sitter, the viewer, and the artist, and that there's a triangulation that is occurring there to create the meaning to this image. And my question is, so do we know if he voluntarily took this image, and you mentioned that's something that you wonder about. How would we go about finding that out?
That's a good question. And I don't know. I do know that Chief Joseph, from what I've read about his life, he recognized the importance of popular opinion, and he recognized the importance of getting white people to invest in the plight of indigenous nations. And so he very well might have wanted to have his photograph taken and dispersed. But even then, the idea that we don't know, if he dictated how he was going to pose or what he was going to wear, that adds layers to it.
Mm-hmm. And that's really interesting. All right, so I'm not going to get super deep into this, but this is, as as you mentioned that oftentimes Curtis, the artist, the photographer, wanted to romanticize Native peoples, regardless of how they thought about themselves. I can't, that really, no pun intended, reframes the way I think about this and look at his image where, there's a lot of emotion on his face. And, oftentimes, there have been narratives, and you mentioned this earlier, this monolithic narrative of U.S. history, and part of that has often been that indigenous peoples are of the past, and I can see how images like this one, where Chief Joseph is literally trapped in a box, whether he's wearing these clothes of his own volition or not, we don't know, but it's very, very much captive, the image and the person in space and time. So that's really fascinating for you to bring that up and let us know about that, because I've never really thought about the role of the sitter with regard to dress, and all the choices that the sitter is either given or not given. Thank you for this cultural resource. We are going to go to one more before we pause, and this is called Signs, and there's a lot going on here. This is quite visibly and visually a collision. So can you let us know what is crashing together here, please?
Yeah, Robert Rauschenberg was commissioned by Time magazine to create cover art for an upcoming magazine issue that was going to highlight the advent of the 1970s, this, ushering in a new decade. And so he created this to sort of encapsulate the past decade, the 60s. This was in 1969. And I guess when the editors of Time magazine saw this, they passed because they did not like what they were seeing. But like you said, I think part of the reason why this might have been rejected is because it is just fraught with struggle and collision. At the top, we see Janis Joplin, the singer, performing. Apparently, Robert Rauschenberg, the artist, went to the same school as Janis Joplin, and so her death prompted this image. And she was a leader of the hippie movement, of this whole counterculture movement of the 1960s. And she's flanked, she's surrounded by these competing images of Vietnam soldiers and anti-war protesters. And that was a struggle that was at the forefront of the 1960s in the counterculture movement. Then just below her are images of John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy. And their deaths in the 1960s were a wake-up call to a lot of people who were really invested in the idea, the post-World War II idea of the American dream, and the attainability of the American dream and American exceptionalism. And then just below them, there is an image of a wounded civil rights activist. And then below him is, of course, the photograph of Martin Luther King Jr. Lying in his casket. And these images serve to further push back these long-held notions of U.S. exceptionalism and the monolithic culture that we talked about. And the counterculture movement was this group of young writers and thinkers and just students, people who recognized that there was a different version of U.S. history and a different interpretation of contemporary U.S. culture. And they collided against the status quo. And I think all these collisions that we see here remind us that all of these cultural clashes can also be very, very productive. They can be catalysts for change. And so we'll talk about that in upcoming portraits as well.
Yeah, the Janis Joplin is, sort of leads the way I see this image. I imagine this, or I hear a cacophony, and her yelling definitely catches my attention right away. And again, goes to show like the power of authorship in the sense that this was denied. I mean, I'd be really curious to think about how, if time would have introduced the 70s by, dismissing this and recognizing, these images as key to the 60s, how that could have shaped national conversations, one of the dominant publications of the time, and still is, right? We look at the Time Person of the Year, that's really interesting when we think of what they said. No, we don't want to think about ourselves in this manner, All right. Well, we're going to pause here for a second. Abby, do we have any comments or questions to interject before we get to our next 3 cultural resources?
Sure. No questions yet. And we certainly do encourage all of our viewers to ask the questions that you might have about the objects you're seeing, about museum practice, about this concept in history of cultures colliding. But I did want to share a comment from a colleague who said it's interesting to think about the relationship between the artist and photographer and the individual being portrayed, plus the viewer, both at the time the image is released and time today with historical context. And this comment came in when you were talking about Chief Joseph. And so I just think it's such a nice thing to be able to see the way that you're helping our viewers process, and that it's bringing to mind other ways about how do we look at images that are available to us today, even if they are historic ones.
Thank you, Abby. Yeah, I've got to say, Beth, the idea of portraits has been really interesting to think about. When, with you and with Vanessa a couple of weeks ago, and this idea of the viewer and the artist as 2 distinct entities, and people who are both bearing on the sitter is really, it's a lot to think about, and sort of the multiple gazes under which the sitter is under at all times. Anyhow, all right, we don't want to get too esoteric in these last 10 minutes, so let's talk about Return to Aztlán. This is really pretty, and when I first looked at this, when I first saw this image, I thought 2 things. I thought, one, this is a great quilt and I want it. And then I, did some more looking into the information and saw that this is oil on canvas. And then the other, thought I had as I looked at this is that, as I zoomed in, I could see that this is, a lot of one of my favorite kinds of art, which is, pointillism routed through Chuck Close, who, does a lot of portraits as well. And the way that he did them is by making these abstract figures in different colors that when you zoom out, you get a very different image of what you see something very different than what you see when you zoom in. Can you please tell us about this? This is such a beautiful work of art, and how it builds off of what you ended with, the signs image from the previous slide.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you like it. This is one of my favorite portraits in the whole portrait gallery collection. And I hope everyone gets a chance to come see it in person back when when the museums are open again, because it's huge and it's vibrant and there is so much going on. And the artist who created this, his name is Alfredo Arreguin, and he just loaded this with all of these references and even with some codes that are visible to some and not visible to other. And I find that so fascinating. This has 5 portraits here. We have, but the main people I want to talk about are on the left, we see Cesar Chavez, and on the right, we see Dolores Huerta. And they were inspired by the peaceful protests of Martin Luther King Jr., whom we just discussed, and the civil rights movement and the peaceful protests of Mahatma Gandhi in India. And they fought for the rights of farm workers, specifically the farm workers in California, and they led a few protests. They led quite a few strikes, and they were fighting for the rights of people who had been marginalized and exploited for centuries because their culture was seen as less important or inferior. Many of these workers were from Latin America, were from Central America. Other workers were from the Philippines, but they were seen as sort of dispensable. And what Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta tried to do was to empower these people to stand up and to unite. And so they created the United Farm Workers of America organization. And Alfredo Arreguin, with this portrait, is he's filled this whole giant canvas with these symbols of Mexican pride. So we have at the top the eagle that became the symbol for the United Farm Workers. And many people have noted that if you flip the eagle upside down, it looks like an Aztec pyramid. And then these faces are actually comprised of much smaller faces that look like masks. And then the masks are painted in these vibrant colors. And so instead of, I guess I should say, instead of painting this within the context of white eyes, I think he's painted this within the context of Latinx eyes, so that people who have any sort of ties to Mexican culture or Chicano culture or Latinx cultures will understand the references that he's painting here, and will see the symbols that he's included, and will feel that sort of pride that he has tried to fill this canvas with.
Yeah, this is, I mean, and, with the composition of it, you see, Hidalgo and Morelos up here and Zapata in the middle, and, literally coming out or from under them, you see Chavez and Dolores Huerta, who, Abby knows Dolores Huerta is the number one person I wanted to meet in the world. And so I got to meet her last year, and that was very exciting. So
oh my gosh.
This is
we'll have to talk later.
Wonderful. All
yeah,
right,
and I didn't mention the other people, but he is tying their struggle or the fight of Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta to this history of agrarian reform and civil rights and the farm workers movement in Mexico as well.
All right, we have about 5 minutes left for these last two cultural resources, and this is great. So the contrast, the lighting, the vanishing point, this makes this a very dramatic scene. The composition is great. We've got allusions to a couple of things here that I'd like to point out. One, we've got the Greensboro counter sit-ins. We've also got Edward Hopper's Nighthawks, which is fascinating to think about, next to these ones. Can you please tell us about these four figures in the photograph who may not be familiar to folks joining us today?
Sure. So these people are Craig Rodwell, John Timmons, Dick Leish, and Randy Wicker, and they were leaders and members of the Mattachine Society, and that name comes from a medieval French term that was used to describe male dancers who satirized social conventions. This was one of the first gay rights groups in the United States, and they here, you referenced the sit-ins of the civil rights movement. They, just like Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, they took inspiration from the civil rights movement and the peaceful protest to stage a sip-in. And so they went to a bar. And there were laws in New York at the time that forbade the congregation of gays in an establishment where alcohol was served. And so these men organized this sip-in. They called the press in. They said, you're going to want to be here. You're going to take photos. And they entered this bar. They introduced themselves and they announced themselves as being gay. And this photographer just happened to catch the exact moment that the bartender put his hand over the glass and said, I won't serve you. You have to leave. And so it's a really interesting image that captures how documentary photography is just as much about skill. And you mentioned like the lighting and the composition, but luck as well, that he happened to capture the exact moment that the hand gets clamped over the glass. And this set off a series of protests and a legal lawsuit that ended up ending the law against serving alcohol to gays. And it was, by some accounts, one of the first moments of gays standing up for themselves on such a large scale, that for so long they had been discriminated against and persecuted, and they just they felt like they had to kind of take it. And here we have an example of people that were protesting that mistreatment.
Yeah, and I think back to how we started this conversation when you mentioned this, collision can be violent, can be not so violent, and sometimes they happen at the same time, right? I mean, this is subtle, but then leads to larger conflagrations that we have at Stonewall, right? And small collisions lead to bigger collisions, sometimes vice versa.
Right.
We have time.
Oh yeah.
Go ahead, Beth.
I was gonna say, Craig Rodwell, one of the main figures, he was a key figure in the Stonewall riots as well. And he also was seen as sort of the grandfather of gay pride, and that he organized what is now considered like the gay pride movement and parades and all of that. So from this little event, it sort of spiraled into much, much more.
Okay. We have time for one more, and it's one of my favorites, if not my favorite MPG. This is just great. There are so many allusions, callbacks to other works of art, other time periods, other places in the world. And can you please tell us about this piece by Shimomura?
Sure. This one is great because Roger Shimomura experienced tremendous cultural collisions in his own life. He then references those collisions in his artwork, and also it's just super brilliant artwork. His family was forcibly relocated to a Japanese incarceration camp when he was a very small child. And he was born in the United States. His parents were born in the United States. And so imagine as a little boy being taught that your American family isn't American enough, and what even does it mean to be American. And so that's what he's singling out with his artwork, is he latches on to a lot of stereotypes, a lot of Asian stereotypes, but then he also latches on to these iconic American scenes, and he sort of fuses them together to force people to address issues of identity and racism. And here he has taken the iconic scene of Washington crossing the Delaware by Emanuel Loaiza, this large-scale painting that's the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and he's created his own this painting is huge. It takes up an entire wall. Created this large-scale painting of this crossing, only instead of the Delaware River, it is the San Francisco Harbor. We see Angel Island, which is sort of the West Coast equivalent of Ellis Island, where a lot of Asian immigrants were processed. And instead of the revolutionary soldiers, we see samurai warriors. And instead of George Washington, here we have Roger Shimomura himself. He has placed himself in the image of George Washington. He's made himself the father of our country.
Yeah, I like the shadows here that aren't the same as clearly this is not a shadow of this because the flag is not there. So Beth, is this a callback to the original?
It is. Yeah, it's sort of like lurking in the background. It's not an exact duplication of the profile of the original, but it's very close. Yes.
All right. Well, Beth, thank you very much for your time and for bringing these cultural resources to our attention, for having a conversation with us about it. Appreciate your time, your expertise, and the way that you put the narrative art together so that we ended up back with what we're called a woodcut, because I really like the Katsushika Hokusai Great Wave off of Kanagawa that I definitely have on a t-shirt upstairs. So thank you for bringing us full circle. Before we do head out, I want to ask Abby, are there any questions that I did not catch? Any comments that we can address before we leave our audience for today?
Well, we did have 2 questions come in. If you'd like to take them quickly, I'll give you both. The first is, this was referring back to the piece called Signs. Any suggestion for kids who may want to create their own collages? And the second, how has the definition of what is a portrait changed over time? Does expanding that definition include the representation of more people? So not a quick question, but.
All right, Beth, what do you think?
First, yes, creating a collage is a great activity for kids. And as you can see from the Signs portrait that we looked at from Rauschenberg, those are just what look like images that could have been cut out from a magazine or a newspaper. But then it's up to the artist in his or her eye to create it in whatever way they want. So that's a great idea. Then the definition of a portrait, how has that changed? I think if I could shift it a little bit, the definition of a portrait has remained the same. A portrait is a visual likeness of a person, but the idea of whose portraits are worth showing, whose portraits are worth creating, for centuries, there was a very limited number of people who could have his or her portrait created because oil painting was the main method. It was long, it was time consuming, or it was expensive. And so it was just white men who had their portraits created. Then over time, as technology has shifted, it's opened up more possibilities for more people to have their portraits created. But even in the portrait gallery itself, we are still working on collecting portraits of people whose stories are not being told because we don't have their images. And I think that is an ongoing struggle that we're still trying to figure out. Is now that history stays the same, but our interpretation of it is shifting constantly. And so now we're finding out these stories that haven't been told, and we want to find images to correspond to them. So I don't know if that's like a very quick answer to a very complex question, a great question.
No. All right. Well, if folks are interested in finding these resources or any others, we will have this URL up in the comments for you to be able to check out at your own time whenever you have that time and space available to you. And I do also want to encourage you to join us next week, where we will be talking about this question: how do maps reflect change and continuity in history? We'll be speaking with Sarah Weichsel from the National Museum of American History and Renee Goki, who is with us from the National Museum of the American Indian. And this afternoon, in about half an hour, if you'd like to talk about this in Spanish and get some other cultural resources, we're going to be speaking with Antonio Curet from the National Museum of American Indian. Beth, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Abby, thanks for keeping us in line and keeping it moving.
Bye, everyone. Have a great day.